Welcome to the Wildlife Wire. I'm Mark Searles,
And I'm Samantha Miller.
and this is your source for wildlife news and the people that make it. On this week's episode, Sam's in the news, coyotes are at Gotham, Washington commissioner out of commission, and logging falls flat. Recording in progress.
Oh, yes, Mark. Are we recording now? Is it time to talk?
We're going to talk words.
Talking words about Diet Cokes, my favorite addiction. How are you?
I am doing well. How are you?
Oh, just waiting for Diet Coke to sponsor us so we can just only do this all of the time.
Yeah, that would be great, except for you would have to really set extra limits on when you get to have a Diet Coke.
That's true. That's true. Gosh, I feel like we're already at the end of the week and we're not. We record middle of the week. It's been a long week, I think, for both of us. We've both been really busy with our day jobs advocating for animals. And I am really happy that my first story I'm going to share is about some of that advocacy work that both you and I were engaging in at the Colorado Parks and Wildlife Commission. If you're ready to hear about it, I don't know if you have something else you want to talk about or you're ready to dive in.
Let's get on that board and jump in.
Perfect. It's a regular hype diving board, not a high dive. My first story actually features yours truly. That's right. This is a shameless plug for myself. I am only in nonprofit work for myself and not
Nobody does nonprofit like Samantha does nonprofits.
Nobody does it. But it also features our favorite foil, Dan Gates of the Coloradans for Responsible Wildlife Management, those fun misnomers we put out there. And it was a story in the Vail Daily about the CPW meeting that we both attended last week, and where we both advocated for better fur bearer regulations in Colorado. And so I've said this before, in Colorado, any animal that has fur that could be sold is deemed a fur bearer. I say that with air quotes, but that's the official title for that group of animals as used by Colorado Parks and Wildlife. And we had really discussed how those regulations in Colorado don't align with science and don't align with values of voters. And so Vail Daily actually did a whole article on that and featured a quote from me about swift foxes, which are a species of conservation need in Colorado. They're a tier 2 species, and they still can be trapped in unlimited numbers in the state, which is wild. It's wild, but so can any other species deemed as a fur bearer. So I was really glad that this was covered in the Vail Daily. I hope it will get wide distribution amongst the mountain area. I think a lot of folks don't know that this is going on with animals with fur. Like if we look at our red foxes, all of us in mountain communities love seeing red foxes. Those foxes can be trapped in unlimited numbers. There's just so many species in that grouping. So I'm glad they did the article. They, of course, Coloradans for Responsible Wildlife Management, of course, said, oh, everything's scientific, nothing to see here, mainly because they'd like to continue trapping and selling fur, like you saw at the fur auction. So glad we're bringing light to it and we're gaining media attention, which is awesome.
Yes, absolutely. And one of our great volunteers also had a quote in there. So really good to hear this story. And I love the headline on it as well. That does Colorado Parks and Wildlife need to update its fur bearer regulations for hunting bobcats?
Right.
And that's a fair title, right? I mean, that is a good news story, unbiased title, which is oftentimes rare these days.
Yeah, I absolutely loved how the story was written. I thought that it was fair and balanced. I did appreciate the quote from Reiner in the story. It was good to see him in there. A strong ally there. And again, this wasn't from a press release. This was just earned media coverage. And I thought the reporter did a really excellent, balanced job in covering the CPW comments.
Yep, they certainly did, and we just hope for more continued good press coverage.
Well, thanks, Mark. So that's my first story. You want to talk to us now? You're going to take us on a side ramp. We're going off the wildlife road and into logging, or does that relate to wildlife? What's going on?
Well, you know, animals live in the forest, right?
Oh yeah, duh. I forgot.
So this one is titled Trump's Executive Orders to Stimulate Logging Could Fall Flat in the Tongass.
Ooh,
And so that is the largest national forest in the US. It's in southern Alaska. It's 17 million acres, and it's one of the last protected temperate rainforests in the world. And so on March 1st, Trump issued two executive orders to expand logging into national forest. And what's interesting with this one is that the while this area was had a big logging industry at one time, they have since shut down the large mills and all of the infrastructure that goes with logging. So they interviewed a gentleman who uh, logs there. He only cuts down about 100 trees each year, and it's a very sustainable harvest. And it's all in second growth forest, and the Forest Service shows it basically picks out the trees, like three trees, and then he gets to choose one out of those three. And so, and what he's doing is those trees are going for building cabins or guitars and canoes and things like that. So really a sustainable practice that he's doing without decimating the forest. But what's interesting to me is that Trump has gone on this tirade like he does, and is really focusing on, well, we got to increase all of this logging that isn't happening anymore. But just because it's a executive order doesn't mean that private industry can do anything with it, right? So if
right.
there's not the willpower on the ground, nothing's going to happen. But at the same time, it's still very concerning that he's really pushing this direction. And I went back and did some research and found an article from last summer about Project 2025. And, he was distancing himself from that. But in there, there's a lot of things that have already been played out.
Yeah.
And one of them was, as far as the fire prevention goes. So this is a really concerning area. So right now, best science informs that we should do prescribed burns. Project 2025 just says, well, let's just clear cut the forest, and then we won't have forest fires.
Oh, wow. Yeah. That's
Yeah.
I guess
So
that's true. You won't have wolf predations if you kill all the wolves too,
I don't.
God. God.
Yeah. So really concerning this complete disregard for natural systems and in search of basic always trying to you look at his financial gain or the financial gain of a few versus the benefits of having things like forest, right, that are complete systems that can help with climate change.
Right.
And reducing those forests is only going to serve to increase the rate of climate change. So really, really sad to hear that this is the direction he's going in, but it's good to know that at least in this one particular area, his power isn't going to hit the ground.
Yeah. And forests are so important for carbon sequestration and as the climate changes, keeping our earth cool. And the other piece we've seen when we were reading Dan Flores' book, who's our guest today, is that forests are such a source of habitat and these clear cuts can be devastating. If we look at species like the ivory-billed woodpecker, if I can get that out correctly, ivory-billed woodpecker, it was deforestation that contributed to that species extinction, with the last bird flying away into the mist as her tree was cut down with eggs in it. And it's such a sad story. And I'm hopeful that states can hold the line in a lot of different ways because executive orders will work for federal government and for federal lands in some ways. But if people have private leases, perhaps that's a barrier or a defense. But my next story really talks about the need
I
for
just want to
states. Oh,
make,
go
before
ahead.
you get there, I
Make it
want to
fit.
make an announcement.
Okay, make an announcement.
If I am elected president,
Okay.
you have my word
Uh-huh.
that my Secretary of Interior will be the Lorax.
Perfect. That's the campaign I was hoping for, Mark. So I am so glad you're going to be president and we can look forward to that in 2028.
Sure. We'll call it Project Dr. Seuss.
Yes, Project Dr. Seuss. Yes, I love this for us. And can I talk about real news now, or you want to
Yep.
keep
No.
talking about your presidential bid in 2028?
Yep. Which is real news. It's just future news. That's all.
Okay, sorry. So, real news, not in the future, happening right now. Uh, in Washington, we have a concerning story because Washington's a pretty progressive state. It's one of the most biodiverse states in the country. It has just wonderful marine life. It has incredible forests. It has a great portion of the eastern state part of the state that has all of this great sagebrush. And I of course live there and love Washington. But something concerning happened in Washington, and that's that after Governor Ferguson was elected, he rescinded two of Governor Inslee's appointments to the Washington Fish and Wildlife Commission. And knowing how the federal government is right now, our states are often our last line of defense for wild animals and wild places. And to have a blue state rescind two progressive appointments is really concerning. But the more concerning part to me is that one of those appointments was Dr. Tim Regan. And Dr. Regan was the former executive director of the U.S. Marine Mammal Commission. He is an acclaimed scientist with a storied career in marine life preservation and conservation. And he is the marine biologist in the country that we want. And so to pull that appointment back in a time of climate change and in a time of an extinction crisis facing our southern resident killer whales, it makes absolutely no sense. And then to not have Dr. Reagan sitting on the commission as you consider his reappointment is really scary to me, especially as we're making decisions daily for our southern residents and for wild salmon. So I am hopeful that Governor Ferguson is really doing this so he can have a more transparent process. That's great. But for Washington to not seize the opportunity to use the knowledge of this incredible scientist with all the crises facing us, it's really absurd. And so you can take action. You can contact Governor Ferguson. There's things we can do. So I encourage anyone to reach out to that office and write letters. But I'm hopeful that he will make this right because we need Dr. Reagan sitting on that commission and holding the line in a progressive state like Washington.
And what was his reasoning behind that?
He said he'd heard from tribes and from a lot of hunting groups that he needed to have a more transparent process. Now, the concerning thing there is we know one of those hunting groups are our friends at Howl. And what Howl for Wildlife does is they really go through and use technology to generate thousands of individual letters directed at politicians to look like there's a lot of support for trophy hunting or support for, only having a hunting representative on the commission. And it's very misleading. And so we know they're involved in Washington, and we know that the hunting groups already have a disproportionate say in wildlife management. Most commissioners seated in Washington and in most states have a hunting or fishing background. So that's why he's citing that. And then with tribal reasons, he's pretty opaque about which tribes and why. There are so many different tribes in Washington with very different views on wildlife management. And of course, tribal consultations part of how Washington manages wildlife too, and that's the process through which tribes provide input. So I am not sure which tribes or whom or why. Tribes are a strong lobby in Washington. They donate a ton to different political campaigns. So we'll have to wait and see why these folks are so concerned with such a renowned scientist maintaining a seat on the commission.
Yeah, that is curious, and I think of the Snake River, and
Yeah.
if that has anything to do with the dams on the Snake River that have been found to be not productive as they're sold, and also you're really a hindrance in salmon. And with his background, I wonder if he has any quotes or anything from the past that maybe have hurt him.
Yeah, I think that in Washington, hatcheries are a huge issue too, in addition to the dams. Um, and hatcheries really prop up the angling and the salmon consumer population. So, salmon, and you can just tell me to be quiet if I'm going on too long because I can talk about this stuff all day. So, let me know, Mark.
Keep swimming.
Okay, I'll keep swimming. I'm going to swim down the salmon stream. So hatcheries produce salmon, they breed salmon, and then they quote unquote plant them. So just like we harvest our wild animals, we plant fish that are bred in these hatcheries in with wild fish in streams to supplement the wild population. And this can cause all sorts of problems. And there's different levels of hatcheries. Some hatcheries have a higher standard than others do. The standards aren't consistent. The levels of operation are all different. And tribal industry also has started to utilize hatcheries for planting salmon. And some of this has to do with their historical treaty rights and all of the terrible things we did to tribes. So complicated there. But anyway, these fish will swim with wild fish, go up to Alaska with wild fish, and then become part of that Alaska fishery that we then buy our salmon from, that gets that faux sustainable label on it, and that then the fish should be returning to their home streams. So we get wild fish sick by putting basically bred, domesticated fish into the water. Hatchery fish are smaller than wild fish, so they're not as appealing to the southern resident orcas, which is causing a problem for the orca prey base and hurting the orcas. And then they also are manipulating the genetics of wild fish too, because of course they're interbreeding. So lots of issues there. That's my hatchery story and my hatchery soapbox for. I think we should have maybe Dr. John Skalski or someone who's more involved in wild salmon recovery join us and really talk about it, because it's fascinating the parallels between how wild salmon are managed and a lot of wildlife populations we have today.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd love to have a guest on that can really dive into.
You're on it. We're swimming and we're diving.
Well, unfortunately, the verb in my story, I just don't know why journalists do this when we're talking about coyotes. So this is out of the New York Post, and the headline here is "Coyote captured after slinking." Coyotes don't have to slink into New York City parking garage. Might be part of Central Park couple.
Oh, there's a
So
couple?
yeah, so last year people started noticing a pair of coyotes in Central Park, and for the most part, it's been pretty positive. Uh, People getting excited about having their new residents there in the park. Uh, this coyote, who they haven't figured out if this particular coyote was one of the pair, or if this is another transient coyote that has moved into the area.
Hmm.
So went into, well, as they said, sneaked into a parking garage. I bet he
Mhm.
didn't sneak. I bet he just walked in there.
Yeah, I'm guessing he walked in too,
Yeah.
just normally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So he went into a parking garage. They called the police. The police came. Here is an interesting development in the story, though.
I'm ready.
So the NYPD says the coyote was released to the marshland of Brooklyn's Floyd Bennett Field, while the State Department of Environmental Conservation claims they transferred the coyote to a rehab center in Westchester. I have a third hypothesis.
Okay. Go ahead, presidential candidate Mark Searles. Let's
I,
hear it.
I think that they both of the NYPD and the Department of Environmental Conservation are trying to cover up because the coyote escaped and made a run for it.
Yeah,
Yeah,
freedom.
freedom. Yeah, because I mean, I feel bad though if this coyote was one of the pair, and I would assume that would become a mated pair,
Yeah,
that to move him or her to Brooklyn is wrong, is cruel.
yeah,
And then or to put in a rehab facility for an undetermined amount of time is also wrong or sad.
yeah.
Uh, but there's a group in New York City called the Gotham Coyote Project.
Ooh.
Yeah, pretty cool. And there was a really great quote from the founder of that organization.
Very relatable.
Yeah, but I'm sure, and he goes on to talk about like the rules, right? And so I talk about that with the coyotes around me is if they have rules that both people and the coyotes have agreed upon, that we're going to share this particular space, and then we will just use it at different times.
Yeah, I
And
like it.
yeah, and it for the most part it really works out, well with coyotes in urban suburban areas, and they just figure out what places are off limits, what times are off limits, and for the most part you just never see, unless you're really going out to look for one, or if one happens to have a bad case of mange. That's the only time, right? But and with mange, those are the ones you often see during the middle of the day wandering around a neighborhood. I've seen them in my neighborhood, and it's really a sad sight to see. And again, back to what is a primary cause of a coyote or fox or many other animals suffering from mange, and it goes back to uh, rodenticide poisoning. And so you know, but so I'm glad that this story is getting interest, and that the city is embracing the coyotes for the most part. And I think
Yeah.
they will only serve to be ambassadors for wild carnivores in the area.
Yeah, I like a Gotham coyote. That sounds like a hero instead of a slinking coyote. I did have a question about the mange piece.
Hmm.
So, didn't the government give them mange too at one point, and that spread across coyotes?
Yeah, yeah. It started in Montana.
Wow.
And so that was part of the extermination campaign that the government, federal and state governments have used So in Montana, the state veterinarian infected a number of coyotes and then re-released them back into the wilds in hopes of them spreading mange. And they
Wow.
did. And yeah, it's just yet another example of how cruel and misguided we can be and the links that we'll go to eliminate any animal that we find unnecessary to have on the landscape.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry. I don't want to end on the sad note. So tell me something fun about coyotes.
Well, one of my favorite things about coyotes that everyone who has a dog or been around dogs can relate to is just like a dog, coyotes will do a play bow.
Oh, I
Yeah.
love that. That's very cute. Well, thanks for that, Mark. And I'm looking forward to our guest.
Well, we have a very special guest today, Mr. Dan Flores. Dan is best-selling author, historian, just really all around provides such a unique angle on wildlife in this country. Because oftentimes when we talk about wildlife issues, we're talking about hunting, like from the hunting point of view, from the wildlife advocate point of view, from the biologist. But Dan gives us this broader context of the view from a historian. And so Dan has three really outstanding books. He has many more, but the three that I always focus on are Coyote America, American Serengeti, and Wild New World, which really gives us a great understanding of many of the animals that currently live in America and then have inhabited America in the past. So thank you so much for being here, Dan.
Yeah,
Well, you bet.
welcome Dan Flores to the podcast. I am thrilled to have you here, Dan, and God, what a sweeping epic Wild New World was. It's devastating, and we can certainly get to that when we get to it, but gosh, thanks for the work you're doing.
Well, Mark, Samantha, thanks so much for having me on. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so I would like to. So we just finished up our news for this episode, and we ended on a story out of New York City, and particularly in Central Park. And there are resident coyotes that live there, and there was a coyote that was trapped was found in a parking garage just the other day. And with that story, with Project Coyote's Coyote Awareness Week uh, being this week that this episode is coming out, and your book, Coyote America, I would like to start off with uh, just a little bit about coyotes living with people in the U.S. and is a coyote in an urban area, is that something that's new, or have they been doing that for a long time?
Yeah, that's a great question, of course, and in part because I think a lot of modern Americans believe that sort of the street version is that coyotes are recent invaders into urban areas in the United States. That this is not an animal that should be living alongside people. And the truth is, coyotes have been living among us and in our towns and earlier in American history in villages and in camps forever, as far back as we can find any kind of records. And the records go back into, the use of fields of study like archaeology. So there's a tremendous amount of evidence that coyotes have been a part of urban life in America for a very long time. In Mexico City, for example, there are still about three or four suburbs that are named for coyotes that date back into the time of the Aztecs. And there's archaeological evidence in places like Chaco Canyon, that great civilization and empire that was in the Four Corners Southwest 1,000 years ago, of coyotes being there in a town that at some points during their grand ceremonies and festivals had 35, 40,000 people. And then when you look at the historical record, where you actually have written accounts from the very first time that Americans, that Spaniards even are recounting stories about coyotes in the West, they're referring to them hanging around camps, hanging around towns. Uh, Thomas Nuttall, one of the great 19th century naturalists, was on the central coast of California in the 1830s and described coyotes running through what is now Carmel and Monterey. So they've actually been living alongside us for a long time. And the reason probably is because of their natural prey base, which is rodents, mice, and rats. And human settlements attract those kind of animals. And whenever that's the case, then coyotes move in. And so this is not a new phenomenon. Coyotes have been with us and alongside us for a long time. They know how to do it. I think our task in modern America is figuring out how to do it ourselves, how to play our side of the game.
Yeah, I feel like the human element is often the problem, right? We are the problem. It's us. And looking at coyotes existing peacefully alongside us for so long, when did we start managing coyotes and why? And I say managing with air quotes just so we know that because it generally means killing. When did that relationship change?
Well, it changed. So let me put it this way for some context. The coyote is not an animal that is found in Western Europe. And so when old worlders came to North America 500 years ago, at the time, although we think in the past there's paleontological evidence that coyotes occasionally would get east of the Mississippi River in the deep past. But at the time Europeans arrived 500 years ago, there weren't any coyotes in the east. So we don't start encountering coyotes until the Spanish settle in California and New Mexico and Arizona, and until the Brits and the Euro Americans began moving westward from the Atlantic colonies and states. And once they crossed the Mississippi River, then they began encountering coyotes. So the coyote, that's a way of saying the coyote was for most old worlders a brand new animal. We didn't really know exactly what to think about it at first. Lewis and Clark, who provided some of the first scientific descriptions of coyotes from their journey across the West, called the animal prairie wolves. They hadn't yet heard the Aztec term from which coyote is derived for the animal. And so they called coyotes prairie wolves. And that was kind of a step in the direction of, okay, so this is some kind of wolf. It's a small wolf, but it's nonetheless a kind of a wolf. And Europeans knew all about wolves because as herders of stock animals for 8,000 years, Europeans had been making war on wolves in the old world for a very long time. And that then, by about really past the middle of the 19th century, began to affect the way that Americans were thinking about coyotes. I mean, I write in Coyote America, of course, about Mark Twain's famous book, Roughing It, which appeared in print in 1873. And he kind of provides the first rationale for what becomes what you described, Samantha, as management, which is essentially launching an all-out war. And Twain, I mean, he's a humorist, and so his passage about coyotes is it's really fun to read, but it kind of casts the animal as a villain in the West. It's an animal, he says, that lurks alongside the immigrant trails and it scavenges anything it can find, and it's such a miserable creature that fleas abandon it for a velocipede, and all sorts of bizarre and funny kind of comments. But the result, as I began looking at the literature in America after Twain's book came out, uh, was that writers were beginning to almost compete against one another to see who could come up with the most despicable characterization of coyotes. And it reached a point by the 1920s when, of all publications, Scientific American ran a story about coyotes that argued that every patriotic American should shoot any coyote he saw on sight, because even though they weren't worth the price of the ammunition that it took to kill them, nonetheless, this was a patriotic act in ridding America of what this writer called the original Bolshevik. This is right after the Russian Revolution brought communism to Russia, and so calling an animal a communist basically was the ultimate attack. So that's kind of what set up so-called management, and it was very much in place by about 1915 in America through the Bureau of Biological Survey.
And so beyond Coyote on that assault on wildlife, were there other species at that time that were also suffering from labels like villain or pest, that we decided as a society that we needed to eradicate?
Well, indeed so. Essentially, all predators fell in that category. And the truth was, by the turn of the 20th century, when we first began developing a kind of a distinction between game, birds, and animals, and those that were not game. In other words, the animals that sport hunters were interested in hunting and the ones that didn't fall into that category. Everything else that fell outside the category, we were going to spend money and exert effort to manage the game animals, but everything that fell outside that category, we were just going to try to get rid of. And what's always interested me, and I've spent some time in Wild New World talking about this, is that Americans made decisions like this before we ever did the slightest bit of scientific investigation to try to determine what role, for example, great horned owls played in the world, or coyotes played in the world, or gray wolves played in the world, or bears played in the world, or mountain lions. We didn't do any science whatsoever. We just brought the old world folk tradition of, if it's a predator, it's the enemy, and you just wipe it out and you don't ever give it a second thought. So, I mean, by the late 19th century, the truth is, of course, we had, as a result of kind of converting so many of America's animals into commodities in the global market, we had reduced in a century's time 30 million bison to fewer than 1,000. We had reduced 15 million pronghorn antelope to only 5,000. And the story went on the same way for just one animal after another, to the point where at the beginning of the 20th century, it was as if the one animal that was something of a mystery for Americans, because we had managed to wipe out so much of the rest of the genetic diversity of the continent. Passenger pigeons, for example, been here 15 million years. They couldn't survive 300 years of our presence. And the animal, though, that became the mystery here was the coyote, because even though it was a target and people were shooting them as soon as they saw them, and they were trapping them and they were sending dogs after them, somehow, in the midst of all these other animals dropping almost to the edge of extinction, coyotes seemed to be holding their own. And so that became a little bit of a kind of a question that American wildlife managers in this early stage began asking themselves, why are coyotes doing this? Wolves weren't doing it. We were successful in winnowing the wolf population in America, but somehow coyotes were resistant to all of our efforts to try to start wiping them out.
Yeah, and it seemed like with coyotes too, the more resilient they were, the more terrifying things the government came up with to try to get rid of them, to answer that question. It wasn't, wow, these are a resilient species, let's learn about their survival. It was, wow, these are a resilient species, let's learn how to kill them. Can you talk a little bit about those eradication campaigns launched by the government and how they're still working today?
The Bureau of Biological Survey was an agency that came about as a result of the work of its early director, C. Hart Merriam, who was a Yale-educated scientist. But of course, like everyone else in America, he had sort of absorbed this folk tradition from the old world that predators were the enemy. And what Miriam and his right hand guy at the Bureau, whose name was Vernon Bailey, he was kind of a poorly educated Minnesotan, but a guy who was really good at trapping animals and really knew animal natural history pretty well. What these guys began to realize after the Bureau had been in place for about a dozen years was that it was getting increasingly difficult to get congressional appropriation for a Bureau that was dedicated to the science of studying animals. And so they began to advocate for changing the direction of the Bureau to being the solution for the so called predator problem. And so by about 1905, Vernon Bailey began publishing a series of pamphlets on how to get rid of predators like wolves and coyotes in the national forest, because a lot of the stockmen's associations of that day tried to argue that by creating public lands, the United States government had essentially designed habitat for predators, and that's where predators were breeding and fleeing to. So Bailey started writing these pamphlets on how to get rid of mountain lions, coyotes, wolves, bears in the national forest. And after some success in doing that, and he started going around not just to the national forest, but eventually to the national parks, the places like Yellowstone and Glacier, and advising their directors on how to get rid of the predators inside the parks so tourists could see the beneficial animals. By about 1915, Congress decided that, wow, rather than the old idea of bounties paid by livestock associations and states, here's the new scientific approach to doing this. And so Congress cut a big appropriation bill for the Bureau of Biological Survey to try to solve the predator problem in America. And it gave them enough money to start hiring hunters. They hired nearly 300 hunters in 1915 and 1916. And one of the things they realized was that if you really want to do your best to wipe out predators like wolves and coyotes, the canids in particular, the best strategy was to poison them. You could trap them, that worked. You could shoot them, that worked, but nothing seemed to be quite as good as mass poisoning techniques. And so starting in about 1915 and for the next 60 years, the federal government came up with a strategy for poisoning predators. They created a laboratory called the Extermination Methods Laboratory, which was initially in Albuquerque and then was moved in about 1921 to Denver. And that laboratory it started with strychnine, but then it came up with one poison after another, a whole bunch of newly invented poisons during the 1930s and 1940s to try to essentially wipe predators off the map of North America. So, and as I said a minute ago, what's kind of strange about it is that even by the time we have developed this idea, the Animal Damage Control Act of 1931 gives the Bureau $10 million for 10 years to completely exterminate coyotes. We still haven't done any science on them. Still don't know scientifically the role they play. And when those studies began coming in the late 30s and 40s, of course, what the Bureau learned was that, wow, it looks like these animals actually are mostly beneficial to humans, but the template was already in place. we need to wipe them out. And so the coyote in particular became what was known as the arch predator of our time in the 1930s and 1940s. And this was after wolves were sort of reduced to the point where there were just nothing but stragglers left. So it kind of played out that way.
Yeah, it's just such a dark cloud on the history of Europeans in America, and I'd like to get your sense on this way we had these views we had of carnivores both in Europe and then bringing those views here and these policies that we had of extermination. I would, if this is a grade, an F minus is what I would give us as being able to live with these carnivores. What would you give our grade today as a country?
Well, we've improved. Um, we're obviously better at doing it today in particular, but I have to confess, I mean, I was on hand in Montana when wolf recovery under the Endangered Species Act took place there. Um, and I live in New Mexico and Santa Fe now, where of course Mexican wolf recovery is really, I mean, it's going much better now than it has been for the last 30 years, but it's still a strange kind of approach. Um, I would say that we may be up to about the C minus level at this point. There are, I mean, and one of the reasons we're better is because there are so many strong predator advocates in the public and among activist organizations that are pushing the Fish and Wildlife Service and state wildlife management bureaus to be more accepting. And we've, I think, probably come quite a long way in understanding the science of the role that predators play in the world. And I really think, and I gave due credit and Wild New World and Coyote America both for this to Aldo Leopold, because by the middle of the 20th century, Aldo Leopold, who had started out as, sort of an anti-predator, anti-wolf kind of guy, and who praised the Biological Survey for the work they were doing. He was present during all those great debates that were happening between ecologists and the Bureau in the 20s and 30s and 40s. And I mean, what you have to say about Aldo Leopold was that he had an open mind, and he based his ideas on the evidence that was coming in through the scientific work that people like the Muir brothers, for example, were doing on coyotes and wolves. And so by the 1950s, or by 1950 or so, Aldo Leopold was arguing that we needed to abandon the old folk approach of Europe, which was not based in science or ecology. It was just based on this idea that, well, Europeans herd animals. Predators sometimes attack herd animals. Therefore, predators are villains in the world and need to be wiped out. And what Leopold was arguing for was the new science of ecology, of recognizing the role that these creatures played in the world. And as he argued, I mean, he reviewed um, the great Wolf book that Stanley Young and E.A. Goldman wrote in the 1940s, that 2-volume work on North American wolves that, of course, took the position of the Bureau because they were employees of the Bureau and had been for a long time. And Aldo Leopold reviewed that book for the Journal of Mammalogy. And one of the things he said about it was that somehow these Bureau, now Fish and Wildlife Service animal damage control hunting people had missed the idea that wolves and coyotes and other predators had been in North America for at the time, nobody knew. We now know that something like 5 million years is the correct number. But Leopold knew they had been here for a very, very, very long time and that they were part of the natural ecology here. And somehow these Bureau people were trying to argue that if you let wolves and coyotes just populate to their natural numbers, they would kill everything. And so Leopold, of course, posed the logical question, why didn't they kill everything before we ever got here?
That's an
Obviously,
excellent question.
they did not. So something is missing from the equation that the Bureau is bringing to bear. So I think we're doing better. Sometimes when I look from a distance at Montana and Wyoming and Idaho and the direction that those three states are going in managing wolves after the Fish and Wildlife Service turned management over to the states, it looks like they're trying to reprise the 1880s and 1890s all over again. I mean, I know that from my own research in the 1880s and 1890s, the territory and then the state of Montana was devoting 2/3 of its annual budgets to paying bounties on wolves and coyotes. And it almost appears now that we're trying to get back to that point and try to reduce the numbers of these animals in those states down to the point just above where the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service will step in and take over management again. And in New Mexico and Arizona, the Southwest, I mean, we've got this very strange thing going where we've put a northern limit of all things, Interstate 40, which crosses New Mexico and Arizona from east to west. That's the upper limit beyond which we're not letting Mexican wolves colonize. And I mean, the argument goes in a lot of different directions here. I was just talking to Mike Phillips up in Bozeman, Montana last week, and Mike argues that, well, you don't really, after all the effort that we've put into trying to make sure that the genetics of the Mexican wolf are sound, we don't want to let them then cross Interstate 40 and get up into the range of the wolves, the northern wolves in Colorado, which will then water down the genetics of the Mexican wolf. And of course, the wolves themselves don't give a fig about Interstate 40. I mean, they're trying to colonize across the West, and they're doing the logical thing.
Yeah,
So that's kind of where we are, it seems to me.
gosh, I know. I followed the wolf that keeps being brought back to New
Oh,
Mexico
yes.
after it wanders away. We
Yeah.
actually will return it back to its home state if it crosses that
Yeah.
border, which is crazy. You had mentioned about Leopold's desire for ecosystems science and ecosystem management, and yet our states, despite having the advances in science, they still manage just based on these arbitrary population numbers. How do we start transforming how our states think about wildlife? And then the second question I had on that was, we still, when we do studies on carnivores, it's usually about killing them. So it's, if we kill more mountain lions, do we get more deer? If we kill more coyotes, will we have less conflict?
Yeah.
All of the studies that we seem to do at the state agency level seem to really focus on persecuting carnivores still. So how do we start making those kinds of shifts within our agencies?
Well, in New Mexico, one of the things we're doing is trying to alter the makeup somewhat of the advisory boards of the state wildlife agency there, so that it's not so dominated as these agencies have been for a century or more, essentially by the hunting constituency and livestock constituencies. Those are the people who have really played the outsized role in the advisory boards to these state wildlife management programs with the expected results, I think. You know, I suppose that what I've had to grapple with in my own work in terms of the decisions that we make and that we've been making for a very long time about these animals is that despite the promise of the Endangered Species Act, for instance, where the decisions are only going to be based on best science, the truth is we make decisions about wildlife around politics as well, around human politics and human desires. And so I think those of us who are hoping endlessly for more enlightened policies toward wild creatures, especially those that don't constitute the game animal category, what we're hoping for all the time is that more science, use the science. I mean, the state of Utah, 15 or so years ago, became one of the few states to still put bounties on coyotes based on the premise that coyotes were harming mule deer populations. And that law was passed at virtually the same time that a brand new 5-year study in a major scientific journal appeared that investigated whether coyotes did reduce mule deer populations in the Intermountain West. And that study argued absolutely not. There's no evidence for it. And yet the Utah legislature just completely ignored it. And that made me realize, okay, the decisions then are not actually about the science. The decisions are about politics and really about what people want. And that probably implies that the only way you begin to get changes is to gradually educate the public more and more and more about the role of ecology and animals in the world. And so confronting the fact that politics is still going to determine oftentimes what kind of decisions we make about wild animals is, a little bit of a sorrowful kind of arrival for me, because I kept hoping, okay, man, we've got the science now to demonstrate this and this, and only to discover that science often doesn't really change very many minds.
Yeah, it is really sad how quickly some of that science can be pushed aside. And, in Colorado, wolves have been politicized so much and a symbol of the rural urban divide. And, the media narrative around it just keeps fueling that fire. And it's really sad to see this animal caught in the middle of that. And I wanted to go into also it's not just the makeup of the wildlife agencies, but here in Colorado, any wildlife bill is going to go into the Ag and Natural Resources Committee.
Uh,
And ag is where I say all wildlife bills go to die.
yeah,
And, it's these traditional viewpoints that don't look at that whole picture, that don't look at the fact that killing coyotes only serves to increase not mule deer numbers but coyote numbers, right? So whenever I get to go in with coyotes, I say, if you like coyotes, don't kill a coyote. If you
yeah.
don't like coyotes, don't kill a coyote. um, but I want to shift to Wild New World, and I have to admit, I listened to the book on tape. I didn't read it, but I had a very unique experience while I was listening to a lot of the book, in that I was on a trip in Yellowstone, and it was such a unique way to hear this history of North America while I'm experiencing one of the remaining wild places in North America. But if you could just dive into the general, the elevator pitch of the book, and then I'm sure we're going to have lots of questions for you.
Well, New World is, and by the way, that what a hell of a place to be listening to it. Um, I've actually had a couple of other people describe that experience. They've
Oh,
taken it on road trips, on Western road trips, and have told me about listening to it in Glacier, or at least one other person in Yellowstone, in the Lamar Valley, no
yep.
less, where you get to see wolves and grizzlies and bison herds and all that. It's kind of like Paleolithic America or something. Well, the book clearly is kind of the natural progression from writing something like American Serengeti, which was about the last big animals of the Great Plains. I refer to the Great Plains as, I mean, the American Serengeti is really what it was. This country that we now think of as kind of a flyover Dust Bowl ag country only 150 years ago was one of the marvels of the world. People came from all over the world to see all these wildlife, all these kinds of animals that were on the American Great Plains. And so that book was preparatory to writing Wild New World, and Coyote America obviously was too, because it took me uh, in the direction of the carnivorous predators and the whole predator story in America. And so I think in the wake of those, I began imagining trying to come up with a single volume that would not be more than 400 pages long at the most. I barely hit that mark. I think that book is 398 pages. But I was trying to do a book in a single volume that would do the big history story of humans and animals in America. And one of the reasons I wanted to do that is because I think the Pleistocene story in America is such a rich explanatory story. I mean, 10,000 years ago, North America had a population of animals that was very similar to the kind of animals found in Africa still today. And somehow we lost many of those, replaced them with the historical contingent of animals that was a remarkable group of creatures to be sure, but not quite as the not quite as big and charismatic as many of the creatures of Pleistocene America. So I wanted to do that full story, and I determined that the only way to do it was kind of to start with the Chicxulub impact 66 million years ago, which reset ecology, not just around the world, but specifically in North America, because that asteroid impact was so close to North America. I mean, it essentially just started life over again in North America, ushered in obviously the age of mammals. But what I was trying to do with the first chapter or so of that book was to explain how North America began to acquire many of the creatures that we think of as characteristic here, along with some that we don't really think of as being characteristic American animals. I mean, the horses of the world evolved in North America starting about 56 million years ago. The camels of the world evolved in North America, and the canids did too. And then there were all the advents of creatures from Asia, especially bison, for example, and mammoths and mastodons, and on and on and on. So I tried to do a chapter that got all these animals in place and that then talked about the emergence and evolution of humans in a far part of the world in Africa. And I started bringing humans around the world then into the Middle East, into Europe, into Asia, with the idea that North and South America were the last big places on Earth that human beings got to. And the reason we were traveling and looking for these places is because we had come out of 40,000 generations of hunting big animals, and we were endlessly looking for populations of animals that hadn't been hunted by people before. We were looking for innocent and naive populations, and we very definitely found them in North and South America. So the story then was to get humans into this one of the most biologically diverse continents on the planet, in the case of my book, North America, and see what happened when humans arrived. And then in the wake of what happened, which in fact appears to have been a massive extinction scenario of a lot of creatures that are no longer here, mammoths and saber-toothed cats and dire wolves and on, we have this 10,000 year period before old worlders get here where native people occupy North America, and somehow, for some complex of reasons, managed to preserve biological diversity here, or almost everything that remained after the Pleistocene, for 10,000 years. I could find evidence of only one extinction during that 10,000 year period. It was a flightless sea duck on the Pacific coast. And so I tried to write a chapter there to explain how that happened and why Native people were able to do that. And there are 3 or 4 reasons that I advance, all of which probably intertwine to do it. And then the next story, of course, is the coming of Old Worlders who bring some very unique things to North America that hadn't been in place before. For one thing, they bring this old herding culture. They had domesticated crops and domesticated animals, which Native people, although they had domesticated some crops and had agriculture, they had not really domesticated very many people. I mean, very many animals. Wild turkeys had been one, and dogs, of course, were another. But most of the ungulates in North America had never been domesticated. So here come Europeans with all of these domesticated animals. And of course, we bring from Europe all the diseases that go with living around domesticated creatures. And those old world diseases end up devastating the human population, the native population of North and South America. We even have a term for it. We call it the Great Dying. Um, a population is reduced by something like 80 to 90% in North America by these old world diseases, which allows the release of many of the animals in North America. And a lot of our descriptions of what a wonderful place North America was as an Eden of animals comes from that very factor. But what I tried to examine at that point was a couple of other things that old worlders brought along that were unique to their own experience. And one was a religious tradition that argued for humans as being exceptional to all other creatures, the only creatures that were made in the image of a deity, the only ones with souls. Everything else was just created for us to use. And when you combine that with the economic system that they brought, which was basically global market capitalism, then you're all set to look at animals in North America as just commodities, sort of like grass or trees in the global market economy. And so we arrive and immediately start killing off the beaver population and immediately start killing off the muskrat population and immediately go after the sea otters on the West Coast. And then we go after bison and it's just one animal after another. And meanwhile, with the herding culture we bring, we're making war on the predators. I mean, the very first environmental act that Old World was ever passed in North America was to place a bounty on dead wolves, which Massachusetts Bay Colony did in the year 1630. So that obviously put in place a very different way of organizing how a civilization and a culture treats wild animals. And the result is this kind of devastation that we've already talked about a little earlier in the program. I mean, it's kind of almost, it's unbelievable. And I will really say that when I was writing a lot of these passages in the last 5 or 6 chapters of Wild New World and talking about, in some cases, these animals one by one, passenger pigeons, Carolina parakeets, gray wolves, Mexican wolves, I would write 3 or 4 pages, and then I would have to take my dog for about a 2-hour walk to kind of clear my head of some of the imagery. Now, I will say, I mean, Wild New World is not a complete bummer all the way through. We get to the end, and of course, I think things start improving in the 20th century, and I certainly regard. I mean, I wrote an op-ed for Time magazine about a year and a half ago about the Endangered Species Act as kind of this great uh, sort of Hail Mary that manages almost at the last minute to try to save much of what we were threatening to completely wipe out. So there's a kind of an upward arc at the end of the book, but yeah, it's a pretty damn tragic story for a lot of it. There's no question. Despite all the great naturalists that I try to write about, the John James Audubons, of the world, the Florence Merriam Baileys of the world. I mean, they did wonderful things at all these great points in the story, but a lot of the underlying story is can be grim.
Yeah, I think anyone who cares about wildlife should read this book because the history it's really tragic. I did have to take breaks while reading it too. I would tell Mark I'm going to take a break again because it's tragic. I think even when you look back at Audubon and other naturalists, they were just killing animals as soon as they saw them to study the specimen, as they would say. So,
Sure. Yeah.
the numerous deaths of birds, that way was surprising to me. I didn't know that piece of history. The other piece that I thought was interesting with the old worlders coming in was how they forced indigenous cultures to shift towards exploitation of animals. And maybe you could speak to that a bit because there's a completely different element of colon of European colonists that show how we've really shaped Native American cultures that did coexist with animals and then moved that towards exploitation by
Yeah.
force.
Yeah, that's it's good for you to mention that and bring it up. It's actually something that happened all over the world with indigenous peoples because the global market economy would tend to focus for one thing, the global market economy out of Western Europe, having gone through the stages of the Neolithic Revolution. I mean, Europe had been settled by people a lot longer, for example, than the Americas had. And that part of the world had gone through the stages of the agricultural revolution and domestication and the invention of metallurgy and eventually the Iron Age and so forth and embryonic manufacturing before many other parts of the world had. Uh, Europe, of course, was connected to Africa and Asia, so benefited from the diffusion of ideas from all those places, and thus arrived in North America with a technological advantage, particularly in terms of metal objects, metal tools. And Native people in the Americas, not having gone through that particular stage, proved to be very susceptible, as people all over the world were, to the arrival of Europeans who offered things like metal arrow points, metal hoes and rakes, not to mention things like guns and gunpowder and all these technological advantages to the indigenous people. And so, for indigenous people, the one thing that Europeans tended to designate as here's your resource that we would like to have is usually the pelts and skins of wild creatures. And as a result of that, Native people get snagged. It's almost impossible, really, to resist getting snagged by the global market economy and the offer of a transformative technology if you will just trap beavers, if you will just kill buffalo, if you will just come up with these products that the Europeans are interested in acquiring for you. And so that phenomenon starts on the East Coast and it basically spreads across all of North America. And there, to be sure, Native people, Native leaders who try to resist it, who try to call on their tribal members, don't just stick with our own technology, don't accept these things from the Europeans. But the truth is, if you didn't do that and some other tribal group nearby did and armed themselves with metalware and with guns, then all you had really done for your particular group was to disadvantage them to the point where they might end up getting wiped out. And so almost nobody really from the native side of the equation could resist. And these people they were drawn into the market economy. And I, obviously go to some effort to explain how it happened and why it happened and to also be completely understanding of it because it's the kind of thing that hardly any of us today is able to do. I mean, we're not usually able to say, oh, no. So there's some new digital technology that's available, like a smartphone. Oh, I'm not going to I'm not going to do that because that harms, we're going to have to engage in a water mining project in Indonesia in order to build chips for this. I don't do it, and I don't think very many other people do either. So it's just kind of an exploration of human nature confronted with these transformations and how people react to them.
Yeah, and with wildlife markets, I thought that that was one of the things that I took away that was so interesting was the contribution of wildlife markets and wildlife exploitation to mass extinction, especially looking at bird feathers. That was one of the stories that was
Oh, yeah.
really shocking to me.
Yeah.
How do you think we can learn from that history today? It's been really interesting, and Mark and I have talked about this a lot, to see that we still allow certain species of wildlife to be commercialized, and we label them as fur bearers, and allow those animals, fur, and coyotes are one of them, to be sold in markets and then shipped abroad. How do we learn from the past and shape the future, even though we still do this in some ways?
Well, it's a really good question, and I'm not sure I have an answer for the contemporary period. I will say that, and I'm encouraged, maybe not surprised to hear you say that the plume trade was not something you really were aware of. One of the reasons I wrote um, Wild New World, I mean, Coyote America and American Serengeti too, is because I was virtually certain that I was going to be presenting stories about America that most Americans had no idea about at all. And so I wanted to put together these stories, hoping that they would, if people read or listened to these books, they would stick in their heads and people would understand this has been part of how we made America the greatest country on earth. In the process of doing that, we also had this kind of impact. I mean, one of the things I will say that surprised me when I was writing about, for example, the plume trade or about the people who were existing as trappers of coyotes and wolves at the beginning of the 20th century is how many rural Americans rose from poverty to becoming middle class citizens who were able to buy homes, able to buy land, herds of cattle. In the case of one of the famous plume hunters, he bought an island and a yacht by killing animals. This became one of the ways that you could rise into the American middle class was by killing animals because there was actually a market for those animals. And maybe the conclusion to draw from that for the modern age is this is what they did with the plume hunt to try to end it. They went to the consumers at the far end of that trade and said, look, stop buying the feathers of these tropical birds. Stop buying the plume feathers of flamingos. We're going to wipe them out if you keep buying stuffed birds to put on your hat. And so going at the consumer end may be one way, for example, to get people to stop in our present age the exploitation of animals like coyotes or other fur bearers and just convince people, look, you don't really need a coat that has a coyote lined collar. That ends up producing an effect in the world that you might not be all that happy with if you understood it and if you understood the role that that kind of thing has played in American history.
Yeah, it is so important. And I know that Canada Goose used to line the hoods on their jackets with coyote fur, and after consumer backlash, they have stopped doing that. One of the issues that we face with the fur-bearing species is that oftentimes we we can't pressure that consumer but that is buying those furs because they're in China and Russia primarily.
Yeah.
And so It's getting pressure on that middleman here, or taking those markets away here. That the few that remain, the state auctions around the West. I do want to move to uh, a different question here, and I think I know the general where this is going to be because we both share an affinity for the plains. I say that I moved to Colorado for the mountains, but fell in love with the plains. And because you have such a vast history of North America, and you also have such a great passion for wildlife, you got your time machine, you got one time and place you can go in North America. Where are you going?
Boy, that's a terrific question. You know, what I think I would love to do is to have been along on one of those early explorations. You know, I mean, the Lewis and Clark expedition is clearly the one that sort of comes to mind initially, into the Great Plains and into the West, because I think particularly for Lewis and Clark, and they explore across the West from 1804 to 1806, obviously all the way from the Mississippi River to the Pacific coast and then back again. What they're really getting to see is the last vestige of that prior 10,000 years of native managed America, of what I call in Wild New World, Indian Native America. Or I actually call it Native America in that particular book, because that world to me would have been, I mean, I've used in a couple of the books, I think in both Wild New World and American Serengeti, I use this extraordinary quote from John James Audubon, who saw that world in 1843. And he just provides this litany. He's on a steam vessel going up the Missouri River and kind of on the prow of it, watching as the boat ascends the Missouri. All these animals, wolves lying on sandbars like dogs, herds of bison cantering beautifully along a picturesque view, he says, along the bank of the river, elks swimming on both sides of the steamboat as they're going up, bighorn sheep on the pinnacles looking down on them, all sorts of waterfowl arrowing up and down the river. Buffalo, he says, it's like the sound of distant thunder that's just going on all the time. And he sits down and tries to write his wife about getting to see all this at one point when he's on this 1843 journey. And he says, you know, I'm sorry, I'm too excited to keep writing. I can't put anything else down. And so I think something like that, you know, and to me, Audubon certainly saw a version of it in 1843 that completely floored him. And I have often imagined, man, what was it like for Lewis and Clark, you know, from the Mandan villages westward to the Rocky Mountains in the spring and summer of 1805. I mean, their accounts are just full of the most extraordinary descriptions of what all they were seeing. So yeah, I think if I could enter a time machine, I would want to be some innocuous member of the Lewis and Clark expedition, just kind of hanging back and saying very little and watching and observing.
I'll see if
Wow.
I can set that up for you.
Okay.
Yeah, I I think that's a great choice. And from time machines going backwards to time machines going forward, your book at the very end starts touching on cloning and genetics research as a way to save endangered species. I'd love to hear you chat about where we are in the state of cloning now and what you learned in the book, because that portion was fascinating. I was like, are we getting woolly mammoths? I don't know. That one guy said, maybe in 5 years we will. So that's my
Yeah.
last question really about this book.
Okay. Well, yeah, that's another great one. So I will, admit full disclosure here. I have actually about a year and a half ago, I was asked to join the Conservation Advisory Board of Colossal Biosciences, which is probably the lead organization that is attempting to do this these days. Colossal Biosciences is working on the de-extinction of the woolly mammoth. And some of you may have seen in the news just a week or so ago that they had tried some of their gene editing on mice first and had produced a woolly mouse with all the cold weather adaptations that would ultimately go into an Asian elephant in order to make it into something like a woolly mammoth. And Colossal was also working on the thylacine, which is the Tasmanian tiger, or it's difficult to say whether it's a cat or a canid, but the thylacine is a predator from New Zealand that has been gone since the 1920s. And so they're working on that. They're working on the dodo. They're attempting to de-extinct the dodo and working on several other species about which I think here in the next months or certainly the next year, we're going to get all kinds of announcements of the various successes that they're having. And since I'm a member of their Conservation Advisory Board, I've also been to their labs in Dallas and seen their scientists at work. And it's a very exciting thing. There, of course, are moral dilemmas here because it's one thing to recreate the animal itself. It's another thing to recreate the ecologies that surrounded animals like woolly mammoths, for example. I mean, the woolly mammoth does not exist as a completely separate thing. It had to have had predators, and we think, of course, saber-toothed cats were probably the predators of woolly mammoth calves. And in addition to needing a more rounded ecology, you also need places to put these animals in the world. And with woolly mammoths, the idea is, before Russia invaded the Ukraine, the idea was, well, we're going to create a Pleistocene park in Siberia, and woolly mammoths released there will help restore the grasslands and maybe prevent the release of methane from the melting of the permafrost. And so they'll have an ecological function in these northern climes. Well, with the invasion of Ukraine, that idea is not so current anymore. So the question obviously is, if you create these animals, where do you put them? And the other thing that worries me a little bit is that I know enough from having written these books that animals have culture. The gray wolves in America that were being wiped out in the 1920s and 1930s exhibited all sorts of evidence of having absorbed and learned how humans were trying to take them out. And that to me was evidence of a transmission of culture across generations. And when you start, for example, with a brand new woolly mammoth or a couple of woolly mammoths, how do they learn about the world? Because they don't have antecedents in their line to teach them how to survive in Siberia or in the Brooks Range of Alaska or something. So there are problems. On the other hand, I'm excited, like everyone else, I think, is about the idea of maybe being able to resurrect some of these lost creatures. And I'm also, it gives me a little bit of hope that some of the things that appeared to be a done deal in the past can be undone. There are just additional questions. And I think one of the reasons I joined Colossal was I wanted to be in the loop. I wanted to know what was happening and not just be reading about it in the newspapers.
Oh my gosh. I pictured you going to an island, not to Dallas, but it does seem to mirror. That sounds almost like science fiction. You've seen so many of these different scenarios play out in Jurassic Park, but that's so cool. It's really cool to hear that. And what a new frontier that really is, as far as wildlife and de-extinction. Wow. Mark, did you have a final question for Dan before we let him go? We have kept him longer, I think, than most guests. I could talk to you all day. Dan. So go ahead, Mark.
Oh, no, I won't go on. I will share that this morning I shared with Sam. I saw a video about the woolly mouse, and if you ever want to see an adorable little critter, take a look at a woolly mouse. It is fascinating. But yeah, I think there are so many ethical and scientific uh, things to look at when we're talking about rewilding with species that have gone extinct. So I'm very thankful that someone with your background is able to be there for Colossal. But no, I don't have. I have many, many more questions, but we will save those. But I just wanted to thank you for this enlightening experience of going into our past, and hopefully we can gain some great lessons to apply to the present day, and especially thankful for you being here, being Coyote Awareness Week, and with Coyote America being the book on the history of coyotes in America. It's very fitting. So thanks again, and we appreciate you.
Yeah.
Mark,
Thank you,
Samantha,
Dan.
thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
This has been an episode of The Wildlife Wire with me, Mark Searles, and my co-host, Samantha Miller. Thank you for listening.